This is the first video for section 2.8 on weighted voting systems. In this lecture, I'll be talking about definitions and notation. So the basic idea that we want to consider is that in many voting systems, the voters are not treated equally. Even though that was one of our principles of fairness when we talked about voting systems earlier in this unit, there are certain systems where we don't want to have the voters treated equally. For example, in a jury, if one voter votes not guilty, then the result is not guilty. So they're not being treated equally. Even if the other 11 people on the jury say guilty, the one not guilty vote is enough. In stockholder meetings, if you have more shares of stock, then your weight is voted more heavily. In the US Electoral College, larger states get more votes. And similarly, in the European Union, larger member countries get more votes. So we have this sense of a system where the voters are not being treated equally. And I'm going to give you more examples in this lecture. Another example involves groups of voters. In most governments around the world, different parties are represented in a legislature, and most often members of these parties vote in the same way. If you pay attention to political news, you might hear the phrase, a vote along party lines. That's the idea that everyone in the one party voted one way and everyone in the other party voted the other way. So we can simplify that sort of situation by thinking of each party as being one single voter, where the number of seats that party has is the number of points that that voter's vote is worth, and the more power that voter wields. So that's what we call the weight of the voter. So the weight of the voter is the number of points that their vote is worth. To go back to the Electoral College example, in 2008, Pennsylvania was worth 21 votes in the Electoral College. So that when Barack Obama won Pennsylvania, we can consider the entire state as one single voter worth 21 points that went to Barack Obama's total. These systems are most often found in legislatures or other governing bodies. Again, we're thinking of each political party as being one single block of voters or one single vote that's worth a certain number of points. And in those situations, the votes are always for or against a bill or amendment, some kind of legislation. So everyone's voting yes or no. So that's not always what we're doing. Again, in the Electoral College, we can vote for a bunch of different candidates. But just to simplify our understanding of these weighted voting systems, we're going to always assume that every vote is either a vote yes or a vote no. Now, the number of votes necessary for a motion, which is a sort of blanket term that could include bill, amendment, legislation, and so on, is called the quota. So the quota is the number of points you need for a bill to pass, for yes to win. So that's not always just a majority. In the US Congress, for example, a 2/3 majority in each house, in the House of Representatives and the Senate, is required to override a presidential veto. So if there's a bill that gets passed, but then the president vetoes it, and the Congress wants to pass it anyway, 2/3 of them have to vote yes. So if we count that up, there's 435 votes in the House of Representatives. So 2/3 of that is 290. So 290 votes would need to be yeses, and 290 would be the quota. In the Senate, there's 100 votes. Now, if we multiply 100 by 2/3, we don't get a whole number. We get 66.66666. But that means that we need at least this many votes to pass. So in other words, 66 votes would be less than the quota. 67 votes would be needed to vote yes to override the veto. In another example from US government, in the US Senate, 60 votes are required to stop debate and force a vote on a bill. So if the 60 votes are not available, then that means that senators can filibuster, which essentially means to debate endlessly, and that essentially kills the bill, where you say, well, we're never going to vote on this because we're just never going to stop filibustering. So really what you find in the Senate is that the quota to stop a filibuster is 60 for most things. There are some things where a majority is enough, but for many things, 60 is the number that you need instead of a simple majority. And that's one of the reasons why, again, if you follow political news, you might have heard that it's really hard to get bills to pass the Senate because it's really hard to get 60 people to vote in favor. So a lot of things end up getting stalled in the Senate. In the Electoral College, we have plurality elections in the US in each state, and the candidate that wins each state sends electors to vote for them in the Electoral College. There are a couple states that were exceptions where the entire state doesn't have to vote that way, but generally this is how this works. So the number of electors per state depends on the size of the state. Bigger states have more electors, and the way that we figure out how many electors each state has is through apportionment, which we learned about earlier in this unit. So this was the picture of the situation in 2008 for the number of electors, the number of points each state was worth. So you notice that you see a lot of 3s and 4s, right? So a lot of these 3s here, those are states that have a low amount of population. And the bigger states, the states with a high population like California, Texas, New York, those are states that have a large number of electors. So when you think about, and again, if you follow political news, when they're ramping up to presidential elections, they're thinking about, okay, which states can we win, and how do we get to the number of points that we need to win the election? And the candidates end up campaigning in states, for example, like Ohio or Florida, that are worth a large number of electoral votes and also often go either way in elections. So we've talked about these weighted voting systems. We're going to get into the mathematics of this in the next lecture, but we're going to have a compact notation to describe the system. So we're going to have a square bracket, and then the first number here, that's the quota. So remember, the quota is the number of votes yes needed to pass a bill. And then after the quota, we put a colon, so these two little dots are a colon, and then we list a whole bunch of numbers separated by commas, and those are the voters. Those are the weights of the voters in order, and usually we list them from largest to smallest. So if we're going to think about the Electoral College that we saw on the previous screen, so 270, that's a majority of the total number of votes, so that's the quota, and then 55 here, that's California, 34 here, that's Texas, 31, that was New York, and so on. And then all the way at the bottom are the smaller states like North Dakota, South Dakota, Montana, and so on. So that's what that system would look like. Now, obviously, that's, there's 50 states. There's also the District of Columbia is in there, also gets to cast electoral votes. So that's much more complicated than anything we're going to consider, but that's the kind of thing you want to have in the back of your mind as we consider some simpler systems. So remember, in the US, we largely have a two-party system. We've got the Democrats and the Republicans, and when one party has a majority, they get to pass the laws they want, and the other party doesn't. So it's very sort of binary here in the US. But in a lot of other countries, there are many parties, right? So there might be 6 or 7 major political parties, and none of those parties are going to have a majority on their own. So what ends up happening is that those parties need to form coalitions to work together to pass or to block legislation. And that's what we're going to be talking about in the next lecture.